And we're live with our 190th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. We're excited to be back as always. We've got a few things that we want to run through today. First and foremost, if you are going to be at DeepSec next week or are in Vienna or the surrounding area, please let me know. I will be there. We're teaching a smaller version of the course. We still have a couple of seats available if anyone would like to attend. That's at DeepSec Vienna next Tuesday, Wednesday. And yeah, would love. I'm going to be bringing at least a little bit of swag with me. It's a long trek, but I'll have a couple of t-shirts and at least some stickers and other things for Absolute AppSec, and would love to go grab a drink or whatever else with anybody that's in that will be in Vienna at that time. Besides that, we will be at CactusCon in January. We did get the notification this week that we'll be doing a workshop, a secure code review workshop. It's going to be a little bit different than our normal course. Won't be the full training that we normally do. It'll just be a one-day deep dive, probably led by me, Ken, and then Justin, who works with me, digging into a specific code base. So if you're going to be at CactusCon, want to come to the workshop, let us know what code base you'd like to dig into as we implement the process against an open source code base. So we're thinking something similar to Absolute AppSec After Dark, the secure code reviews that we've done there, but in a live context. And we will be doing a version of the podcast as well at CactusCon. So during one of the speaking slots, we'll have a couple of guests, and we're going to be doing a state of application security talk / episode / live streaming, and see how that works. Yeah, I think that's everything, Ken, unless I'm missing something else right now as far as announcements go.
Do we for CactusCon, the panel portion, is this one of those things? I actually forget. We're going to choose folks at the conference? I don't think we've done that yet, right?
Yeah, we don't know who else is going to be on the panel with us. We'll determine once we see who the attendees are. I mean, I know that Mike McCabe's going to be there, right? Like I'm sure we could pull him up, ask some cloud security stuff. But it'll depend on who else is down there. We do have a bunch of contacts in the Phoenix, metro area that we could pull onto stage. If there is a specific guest that is going to be there that you would like to see talk to us about application security, please, reach out, let us know. But we're excited about it, right? That's end of January in Phoenix. That's a little closer to home than DeepSec is. But we do have a few other things on the horizon. I know there's going to be a training coming up in Seattle sometime in the spring as well, March, April timeframe. I don't have a lot of details on that yet, so watch this space if you're interested in the secure code review, as well as some international trips next year that are on our radar already. So there's a lot in the works. That's all I'm saying. If you want to be involved, just follow us on Twitter, or as long as Twitter's still a thing, right, Ken?
A lot of people have been sending me Mastodon links, which is ironic. I won't get political, but I've seen the Mastodon links from both sides of the political spectrum. It's just funny now to see the flip to a different political spectrum side being like, now we're going to do Mastodon. Like, I don't know. It's just funny. The world cracks. I'm sorry. Society cracks me up. That's all. It does. It does.
Yes.
As a impartial observer at times. So there's room for, because that's actually what I was bringing up is like, who are we thinking about bringing on that panel, and or is there a room to like you asked, there are certain people. What am I trying to say? Can we ask the audience to give us some advice on who they might want to see? And I think it's funny you bring up Mike, because I actually spent a little bit of time talking to Mike yesterday and listening to his stories about the practical world of trying to, he mostly focuses on cloud security and has been doing that for a few years. at scale. So it's pretty interesting to hear what's good, what's bad out there, and what it's like to do that. Anyways, I know we've had him on the podcast and we described some of that, but anyways, it's always funny to just hear the practical side of like, there's like always the marketing side of things for like tooling and how things, the pretty talks that people give at conferences, and there's the other side of it, the practical, like everyday stuff. And it's just funny how different how different those two things are or can be. I did want to mention too that next week, John Poulin, I have to mention it because John's a good friend. He's a great trainer, and we work together. He'll be out in San Francisco. Yes, he's giving a one-day training, so that's cool. The other thing I want to mention is John is also going to be, I think the next day I don't know the actual date, but I think he's going to be hanging out near the GitHub booth. So if you want to come talk about GitHub application security, John Poulin will be there at the GitHub booth because they're a sponsor. I know he's just going to be generally around the conference, having some. I'm just signing John up for work. No, we talked about it. He actually, it wasn't me that signed him up for that. So, but we've talked about it. He's kind of excited to be, answering some questions and stuff. Also, GitHub Universe is this tomorrow and the next day this week. So that's always fun if you are working at a place where you deliver features on a platform at a conference. It's always a little nerve-wracking. Yep. You don't know what you don't know, so you don't know what you don't know.
How it's going to go.
Yeah. So this will be like my 5th year in a row with that. So this will be, hey, we'll see how it goes. Anyways, I don't think I have anything else to mention besides those things. Just super psyched. It's funny. I actually lived in, did I ever tell you I lived in not Seattle proper, but just outside for like 8 months when I was like a teenager or.
Oh no, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. It was, it's terrible 8 months. We lived there for 8 months. We could only handle because it was like we had gone from the Bay Area to like this was like between the Bay Area, having grown up in that general area, and then like Arizona. And so like you can tell warm weather kind of folks. So we went up there and it was apparently it's like one of the worst rainy, snowy seasons. So it was just like we were miserable. We didn't stay there long. But Seattle was very cool. Downtown Seattle was very cool. I have to say one thing that's really awesome about that area is the public transportation system. It's insanely good. Good. Yeah, for real. So anyways, I don't know what I'm blabbing on about. Let's talk about other stuff.
Okay.
I'll stop babbling.
I would like to start, I think, with that generic list, right? I know it's not necessarily like in the news or whatever, right? But like we can get to OpenSSL, what kind of a non-burger that was. I don't know, like in your world, if it really bubbled up, the OpenSSL vulnerability, because everyone was losing their, shit over it, right? Last week. And then it got downgraded to, from critical to high, and even you could argue from high to medium, just based on what it actually was. We do have an article that's related to it, but maybe let's talk about the Immutable Laws of Security before we get into that, because it was an article released on Microsoft's Learn site within the last couple of weeks, right?
I mean, I want to be clear. Seth found this link and Seth found out this stuff. I had nothing to do with that, even though we're technically
you did by then. Yeah.
I actually had nothing to do with this and didn't even know about the article until Seth brought it up. So I just want to make that clear that I'm not
sure
Microsoft shill.
Microsoft shills that we have on the podcast. Okay, so you should take a look at this article, right? I mean, I find this entertaining, and we did post it in the in chat, right, over like last week after the episode. But the more I got thinking about it, the more I thought it would be a good representation or a good topic of conversation, right? Because there's a number of different things that we always take into account when we're I mean, we're talking about security in general. And yeah, so there's two separate 10 laws, right? There's the 10 laws of cybersecurity risk to start with. And then there's, as reference, there's these immutable laws of security. Maybe I should actually share out. Maybe I'll do that. See if I can share a tab here. Yes. Okay. All right. Now, for as reference, like immutable laws of security, the irony of the fact that it is version 2 of what are supposed to be immutable laws, we can't pass that by. But yeah, I like when you read through this, Ken, because I know you just did before we started today. What was your initial response to like these laws of cybersecurity risk?
Yeah, actually, Larry, Leisure Suit Larry, I just love saying Larry, had brought up that number 6 might be number 1, really, if we're thinking about it in order, which I'm not sure if this is any particular order, but yeah, actually, this is something, and I responded in Slack saying that this is something I'm realizing every single day more and more is 100% spot on and accurate. I don't know if that like a feel good, like we're all a team, we all got to pay. No, I mean literally like for many reasons. For one, so like all the practical reasons we can dive into, but for one, like deduplication of effort. You'd be surprised. I was surprised when we started doing some, because we had to deal with massive growth, and then there comes challenges, and one of those challenges is communication, and then making sure you're not doing the same things in teams that are maybe like, especially in a security org of our size, which is very significant. It's easy to just start working on a project, not realize there's related projects already in flight from other teams. So that's number one, is understanding that like there's probably somebody who has a similar gripe or need or whatever, and is probably going to fix that. And so you should be communicating quite a bit to figure out what those things are. I think one of the ways we do that is surfacing things more and more, like specific planned work at like a security org level where it's transparent, everybody can kind of see. That's been helping, but also just having communication syncs between just various teams to see what they're working on, and then figuring out where there's some meet in the middle ground there. So that's a big, I think that's a very important thing, number 6, like that it's a team sport. So we talked about deduplication of effort. Also, like it turns out for some of our, shift lefter, I don't know how you want to call it, efforts, there were some tools being built as we did more, more of that communication. We realized there were tools being built by other teams that we could actually leverage to help shift left, right? That it wasn't quite as obvious, but as we got into conversations, it became more and more like, oh, okay, well, I think also like because of the nature of putting everything in a transparent sort of like writing up issues and having project boards and all of this stuff and having discussions and all that stuff, that allows people to kind of sift through and then see what you're working on. And again, you'll find ways in which you're like, hey, we have a similar issue. So there's been a lot of that. Communication between departments. So you just mentioned the CVE, and I actually had asked to get it was offered, and I said, yeah, I'd love to hear how we actually went about handling the time leading up to the patch release, and then afterwards. So our PSART team gave us a really cool briefing. They did a great job. They talked about all the stakeholders they worked with, not just in security, but also like outside of security stakeholders from, engineering and product and design, all that fun stuff. So they, and other entities be outside of that. So it was really interesting to hear how they actually got ready for the patch, and then, how that process looked once the patch was released and more information was released along with it. And why I say this is because it was very much a team sport to get ahead of that, be ready, and effectively ensure that we don't have risk from that, potential, or that particular patch. So that's also, I'm going to babble on forever. There's a lot of reasons that you need to work with other teams. So that's basically what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I mean, pulling that up, I think depending on what team you're working on, what the environment is, where you are at, like kind of what the risks are, where your focus is, these laws, will apply, or you would put these in a different order. Just, it's so dependent on the situation. But the interesting thing here, like usually when we come out with these like 10, these 10 laws, these, these lists, these security lists, I usually have some beef with them, right? As far as, hey, I may or may not necessarily agree with item 4, or item 6, or this is up at night. But I find that I'm just nodding my head as we go through these, right? Because this is the same sort of stuff that you and I talk about during the course, right? As far as like making, implementing security in an effective manner, whether that is like doing a secure code review, or doing a security assessment, or building out security champions program, whatever it is. But I did. So maybe what we can do is we'll just like step through these top 10. We don't need to have a huge discussion around each one. But at the very least, like we can put some comments around them. So number 6, what Ken brought up was the cybersecurity as a team sport, right? That's the one that's bubbled up. But I also like number 1 on the list is security success is ruining the attacker ROI. I don't know how many times I have to have discussions with, developers, administrators about limiting the exploit blast radius, right? Or the vulnerability blast radius of someone actually exploiting a vulnerability in a running environment, right? If I can get access to somebody's S3 bucket that houses all their customer data, right? That's a very easy ROI, right? For an attacker, right? That return on investment for attacking a central database of customer information. There's a reason we put so many security controls into protecting that sort of thing. But if we can limit what a user can get to, and it takes them a long amount of time to actually to exploit something that is a flaw, a security flaw, most of the time they're going to turn away, or they're just not going to get the return that they want for spending all that time against it, right? I don't know. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, just to add to that, oftentimes you'll see broad scans of something specific. Often, like when something like the CVE comes out or something's been disclosed. There's many ways this happens, right? That's just one avenue for like mass kind of detection of low-hanging fruit is basically what I'm trying to say. And that's, okay. That's typically an I guess I'm trying to say it's probably more of a opportunity, target of opportunity kind of thing in a lot of cases. And again, that goes on to the whole, like, there's been so many papers, talks, around all this stuff. But yeah, I generally agree. If you can make it really hard and really annoying, then unless you're talking about a nation state or, some high level attacker with a specific goal for your organization, you're going to thwart a large number of, kind of silly stuff. So,
yep. I feel like we could almost reference prior episodes on each of these laws, right? Like I'm thinking about the discussion that we had with Daniel Ting recently, right? Like, about the attack that went on down, or the exploit, the data leak that happened down in Australia, right? That security success, it was so easy drive-by attack wise to pull that data back that it resulted in this huge breach. And that's where we've seen most of those huge breaches happen, to your point, right? The return on investment for the attacker was pretty low. It was almost a crime of opportunity rather than a real hack when it comes down to it. Okay, so that's number one.
On that note, I just want to add, sorry, real quick before we move on, I do want to add, last week's episode touched on productivity always wins, right?
Yeah.
We talked about with the medical space, how people specifically got around the solutions that were in place because it was making their job too difficult. And it was, there was more risk in losing a patient or having some horrible medical outcome than sharing passwords or finding little workarounds for security. So anyways, like you just mentioned that a lot of this stuff is covered in the podcast, and number 3 was just obvious. That was last week basically. So
Yep. Yeah. So number 3, productivity always wins. Number 2, not keeping up is falling behind. I mean, we've spent so much time on this podcast talking about where we get our news, how we stay up to date with security, how it's a constant learning process, right? And, and this is just us in application security as an organization. This goes for every aspect of security, not just application security, but like even compliance and security tooling and network side of things, right? Like if you're not keeping up, you are falling behind. And when you don't keep up, that's where we introduce vulnerabilities into our security lifecycle, right? So yeah, I don't think there's much else to say there, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I actually think us at GitHub are a good example in the sense of we are constantly trying to improve our SDL, right? And that is it's a hard thing to do at our scale right now. Ask me how I know. But anyways,
how do you know? No.
Yeah, I mean, we're running a couple things that are really projects that are, and I'm part of that, which is to shift things more lefter, like I mentioned. We've been doing this for a long time actually, and it's just a constant process of, well, we use the term ship to learn, right? Which is apropos because we make mistakes, we make missteps, but it's all with with getting better in mind, right? And we have to do that because as conditions change, both within the company and outside the company, within technology, right, the technology space in general, you can't. What worked a month ago, what worked 6 months ago, a year ago, doesn't necessarily work tomorrow. And that's the point I wanted to make here, is that it's not. You're kind of setting yourself up for not necessarily like, what is it going to look like in 6 months, but more of like, hey, we have an outlook of a year or two here, and we know roughly what that might look like over the course of the next year or two. So we're setting ourselves up for that today, right? And then in another semester after this planning, the planning and the planned work that went into it is done, we'll look out even further, and it just continues that cycle, because if you don't do that, you'll be behind pretty much instantly. And it's just hard to do that at a product company of this scale, right? So, but it's challenging, it's fun, but you have to do it, right? I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is like, you do have to kind of, I'm just babbling, but you do have to get ahead of things, significantly ahead of things. Just because conditions change a bunch.
Yeah. And I kind of have a love-hate relationship with this, right? It's what makes work and what makes the industry so interesting, because you do have to keep up. You do have to recognize what's new, what's coming down the pipe, what's going to affect your day-to-day when new tools pop up, like how those can be used by attackers and also by, defenders, right? It's not just, it's not just the offensive side that we're concerned about. So it's a constant learning process, right? And you just have to be okay with that in order to stay, to keep your organization and yourself up to date, right? And secure. I especially like number 4, right? Like, attackers don't care. Why do I like it? It's because any component in your application or on your network that has access, and that has access to data or functionality or IPs or whatever, right? Like our networks, can be used in a offensive manner, right? We do threat modeling for a reason. Attackers don't care that this is old functionality. if it's still in the application, it still exists. It can still be used to exploit and to attack the organization. They don't care if this is a webcam that was bought in 1998, right? Like, or whatever. I'm going way back, but if that webcam is on the network or if that printer is on the network, it gives them further access into that network. There's no rule that the attackers have to play by your risk profile and have to pay attention to what it is you are concerned about on a day-to-day basis. If it exists, if it's running, it has to be protected, right? And they're going to use whatever hooks, whatever ways they can. This is one of those where bug bounties has been especially good in uncovering those edge cases, those devices, the shadow IT, all that kind of stuff that exists that's out there for an organization, and why we encourage so much of that.
Yeah.
But go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, just agreeing. I think it's interesting too. And it's difficult because, well, there's now these solutions out to like do that asset inventory. Detect all your assets, so that helps. And then there's like the idea of patching and all of that, but that's predicated on the assumption that where all the things are. So asset inventory, and then just keeping things like that. Also, that you have the ability to keep those things up to date. Meaning, like, patches for desktops and servers and stuff like that. It's easy in the sense that you got your source, your source, and where it's going to go, where it's going to be pushed out to. All of that. You got your software systems to help you with that. But like they're to the point of like, what was there, like something about a fish tank? Like a fish tank thermometer. Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, how would you, what patching would you possibly, or, configuration management would you do on something like that? Right. Which goes back to your asset inventory. So, so it's a pretty interesting one. And you mentioned threat models. I think that's one component, but I think like the red team activities help uncover some of those things as well, ideally. And then your red team typically works to help with, detection and prevention of those things being exploited.
Yeah. I mean, from an application security perspective, I always go back to this. Well, this excuse that I get from developers that, oh, well, that's deprecated. And I'm like, that's great that it's deprecated, but you still have SQL injection on this API endpoint that you are, giving, exposing to all of your customers or the internet at large, right? Like, it's just because it's deprecated in the developer's mind doesn't mean that it's not still accessible and it's not still exploitable. Until it's been turned off and I can't access, or an attacker can't access it, it is an entry point into the application. And the same goes for everything else. I mean, I know I'm guilty of this as well, right? Like stuff running on my internal Wi-Fi network, like at my house or whatever, right? Like all those old devices that we turned on years ago, hooked up to the Wi-Fi, and then just kind of forget about them over time, right? Like if you go do an inventory of your local network, right? Like it's not an easy thing to do, and it takes discipline, right? And this is where number 5 comes into play as well, is this ruthless prioritization is a survival skill, right? We just don't have the time or resources to actually do everything that would be considered security safe or a security best practice. And so you have to eliminate the risks based on a prioritization of what your current threat model is, right? Like, like from a physical security perspective, right? Like you lock your doors, you're probably more concerned about it based on the location that you're at, what you kind of perceive external threat to be. But you prioritize whether or not you perform those functions based on the time, based on the time of day, based on, level of activity, based on visitors, right? Like there's all these different items that you roll into something like locking the doors on your car or locking the doors in your house. But you prioritize that, just from a organic perspective, right? Just based on how you're living your life. But you've got to do the same thing with all of the security tools, your internet life as well, and your organization's internet life. We talk about prioritization when we're doing code reviews and assessments because we are trying to increase our return on investment, right? As an attacker would, as far as, right, like we're going to spend the most time on the most security critical pieces of an application. But that doesn't mean we're going to ignore the rest of it because attackers don't care, right? So like you have to balance these all out. But for you as someone looking at code, doing assessments, living in the AppSec space, you've got to come up with a list of, these are the items that I'm concerned about from an application security perspective, and they rate higher than these other items. That list is going to change, but Ken, how do you actually do this sort of prioritization in your like day-to-day in your work life?
Yeah, well, so there's a couple things to break down there real quick. I mean, all right, so first, there's an interesting difference that I'm learning between, so let's talk about risk registries, because risk registries are like where you typically collect the risks, right? But the problem is, as I'm learning, is that's not the same to every group within security, right? So talk about number 6, it being a team sport. Our more compliance focused risk group has a different understanding of risk than, say, our product security group, right? We are looking at ship level, service level risk, and a compliance, governance risk compliance entity is looking more at, business risk, right? Which is, think of product risk as like a subset of, that type of risk, business risk, right? So it's a tiny subset that factors into the bigger, larger business risk. So that's the first thing, is you have to understand that, I mean, not you, but people have to understand, including myself as I'm learning this, that there is, there's just different ways so different taxonomies for risk, different measurement and scoring for risk, different factors that constitute what type of risk we're talking about. So there's like all these things about risk that you first have to define, clarify, and determine, like how you're going to and why I say this is because the risk registry for that group versus the risk registry for a ship service level risk and the taxonomy and the scoring, they're completely different things. They're related somewhat, but they're like one feeds into the other, but they're very different. So you have to create risk registries for, the place that you're working within. For me, that's product security. And there are other types of risk I'm not even going to get into because it'll turn this into like a forever talk. So anyways, we'll just start with those two. So first, like I said, you got to do all that. Once you do that, then it's really hard because now you need to understand, you need to collect all the sources for measuring risk, right? So you mentioned threat models. That's one thing, right? The outcomes of those threat models have to be durably tracked. So say there's a couple of ways of looking at risk. There's like risk that is just inherent, right? It's the way it's designed, or it's maybe the data that it processes, something like that cannot be changed. It's just inherent to whatever that service is, right? So that's something that needs to be noted, and maybe the outcome of design consultation meetings, of threat models, of whatever type of consultation service internally to the company, there are going to be some outcomes from that, and those have to be durably tracked. And one of those things, like I said, is surfacing like inherent risk. Now, there are other things that have to be measured that can be changed and should be changed. But then it comes down to, when do those need to be changed by, right? So, but that's not super important here for this discussion. It's like, we're talking about prioritize. I mean, I guess it is a little, because it is priority, right? Like, are we talking about for instance, a vulnerability is very clearly like, all right, if it's a high risk, within 2 days, it should be fixed, or within 1 day, or whatever your company's policy is, right? But like something that's maybe an architectural risk or a design risk and can be changed, but maybe it's not going GA for 3 months. what's the measurement? It's not going to be the same, right? It's not going to be like, well, that's a risky type of thing, but it's not a vulnerability today yet, right? So you have to begin to realize like the way you handle the mitigation of vulnerabilities and the timelines you use there and the severity ratings and all that stuff just doesn't apply to this other bit. But that's only one bit of the various sources you're going to use to collect and understand service health in a sense, or service risk. Now that's one grouping. Now you got to think about, okay, well, there are going to be features later added to those services. So those have to be measured. Those individual features, the risk they present have to be measured, but then coupled into the larger service. So for instance, if I have a very low risk feature, but a very high risk service that's going into, where does that leave me? And you have to determine that as an organization. And I know I'm talking endlessly about all of this, but this is a big part of my life right now, is like, how do we ruthlessly prioritize? Like I run currently 2 teams, right? Or, manage overall 2 teams, red team and assessment. And both teams have to decide, how are we going to best reduce risk for the organization, right? Ideally, they're not coming to us and saying, this is what you should be fixing or looking at, rather. Ideally, it's us surfacing that, measuring it, and determining where our planned work and our operations and reviews are going to fall. So this is top of mind for me. Ruthless prioritization is a very hard thing to do once you start breaking down all of those elements. But it's very necessary.
Yeah. And yeah. I like, it's easier for me coming in as a consultant because it is like, typically my assessments are so defined in scope, right? That, it's a lot easier to do prioritization when you're only talking about a single code base, a single application, as opposed to organization wide, when you are dealing with hundreds, thousands of developers, hundreds of projects, hundreds of applications that support the project. All of a sudden you're starting to talk about business risk and in association with security risk. And right, like you turn that knob too far towards security, and all of a sudden you are starting to affect business profitability. And that's a fine line to walk, when all of a sudden you can't actually pay your bills or pay your people because you quote unquote secured an application out of existence, right? And this prioritization goes into it, right? Like this is one of those things that, as much as like you don't like dealing with business people, they are very good at, because it always comes down to does this overall affect the health of the business in a way that is detrimental to us making money and continuing as an organization? Because if it does, guess what's going to go out? That thing that you just suggested that you implement. You've got to take that into account. And that's part of what I've learned over my career, is that listening to the business people talk about risk has actually helped me analyze security risk in a better way, and be able to understand what is appropriate for the organization. Get outside of your box of, geez, XSS is bad, right? Like, or SQL injection is bad. Yes. But like you've got to take into account the rest of the organization. And that's why they recommend here, always start with what is most important to your organization. They don't start with, always look at the OWASP top 10 or the SANS CWE top 25 or whatever is trending on Twitter or Instagram at that moment. That's not where it comes from. It comes from organizational risk, which all these different components feed into.
It's such a challenging thing,
It is.
What I can tell you from my very recent work in this space at an organization of scale would be that, everybody is actually, it's funny, you get people started talking about risk, and that is something it's hard to stop, right? It's hard to stop somebody talking about risk, and it's very, to your point, it's very much based off of where their view is, right? Mm-hmm. Which is why I like working so closely. I work very closely with our governance and compliance folks, because they measure that business aspect of it. And it's funny, we were doing this exercise of just collecting, we do a lot of reviews, and I'm not talking about just security reviews. There's a lot of reviews, and we were like, hey, we should, again, talking about the cybersecurity as a team sport bit, we started talking to other teams and realized, wow, even outside of security, there's a lot of reviews here. Maybe we need to make it clear how, like, which ones are which and how to get to them. And, like, what are the scenarios in which I might want to go through those reviews, and then what reviews and what order and all this stuff, right? And as we started unpacking, it's like, wow, there are a lot of teams that perform different reviews, and all those teams ultimately feed up into this business risk evaluation. And all of those reviews and how they're measuring risk and what they're looking at when we talk about risk, it's just wildly different. But it's super interesting because it's like you said. Let's say I say to myself, well, remote code execution, that's a really serious issue, right? And it is. It's a very serious issue from an application security standpoint. But if, overall, the business risk there was like, hey, it's going to have a small amount of users. It's highly isolated. Also, we have these legal and whatever restrictions that we prioritize getting through those things and reducing down those risks. So that might be having, a bunch of conversations with, I don't know, a vendor or with whoever to make sure that, we're following, or just internally making sure I'm sure you've seen the hullabaloo about Copilot, right? You have to think a lot about those scenarios, because as you ship something, there are inevitably going to be people that, take issue with it especially legally. And so the priority might be, well, we're not as worried about like the application security things for a number of reasons. We're more concerned about these other things. But hey, listen, we want you guys on these calls because there's some technical input needed. So rather than having you maybe spend time doing this or whatever that might not be as impactful, we actually want to prioritize our efforts in this other way. And then we'll get to that part, within what makes sense, like meaning like assessments or reviews or whatever. It's just interesting because it's hard for me to even give a scenario because it's so complex and it's so different in each case. But you're right. The business risk is ultimately the thing that matters. And in this, over my shoulder is this Tribe of Hackers book. And I think in there, I had a quote about like something about like they had asked, if you were to give advice to somebody coming into this field, what would you tell them? And I was like, well, just realize you don't matter that much. Like none of us do. Like we think we do, but you don't. And understand that your job is to give you the best input and advice you can give, right? That's it. But if you don't own the business, that's all you can do. And I love that you want to advocate super hard for it. We should. But if the business wants to go a different direction, that's not your call. And you just have to learn to accept that, because it's going to come up a lot in your career, especially if you're on the blue team, right? The defender team. It's going to happen a lot. So people are going to tell you that's not a huge priority. And you're going to be like, what? Are you kidding me? This is so dangerous. And it's like, well, to you it is, but at the bigger picture, maybe not, right? So anyways, just agreeing, I guess, in a long form with you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is, but and along those lines, like to go back to it, learning to speak business, right? Is, as weird as that sounds, learning to speak to and communicate the threats that you see effectively to business and compliance and other organization or other teams outside of security is going to, it goes a long way to actually getting your priorities up that list. Because, like OpenSSL, not to go too much back to that, but right. If it really is a huge issue, you can cry wolf a couple of times over the course of a year to get something done. But you can't do it every week, right? Like, because other things are going to take priority, right? A SOC 2 type 2 audit or a financial audit is probably going to kind of come above like your annual, assessment at times, depending on where that fits, because from a business prioritization perspective, understanding that where you're at in that cycle, and then also being able to communicate the risks associated with not implementing a control, not doing that security thing. Like, talk about that, right? It's not always just the sky is falling. It's well, what is it? What's the worst thing that can happen if we don't implement input validation on this specific field in the administrator portal? Really, right? Like, you've got to talk about impact. You've got to talk about risk that goes along with it in order to really get something done and communicate that with the business people, the guys that are in charge that are making those decisions.
Yeah, and actually, I want to add to this part right here because one had asked a question about, you know, for smaller organizations with a lack of resources, how what strategies or recommendations do you take? My strategy, like you and I actually, Seth, dealt with this when we were not dealt with, but we had a situation arise like this when we were consulting at the last firm together, and we essentially we had a client. Doing cool stuff, VC funded, really awesome. And they operated mostly out of the cloud, and they had like a newer tech stack. I think at the time it was Node, which was newer to most folks. And so it was like, like I said, it was a hip, doing cool stuff, actually making money already, and VC funded. So they were in a good spot, but they still didn't have even remotely the security resources that they needed yet. Now, what they wanted to do was they actually wanted to start with like a deep dive of all their code bases, or their money making code bases, right? And I think there was something else they wanted to do, and it was so niche. And like basically what we told them was, hey, this isn't, yeah, sure, we'd love to do that stuff for you, we like money and all that, but like this is not the best thing to do first. The best thing to do first is get your basic hygiene minimums into place. You don't have any of that. So, and I'm thinking of like badge readers, how's your cloud, since you're operating so heavily out of the cloud, so like the physical stuff, right? Like how's your physical security look? How does your cloud security look? Like what basic access controls do you have there? What basic monitoring stuff that's free that you don't need to spend more? I mean, mostly free, right? I'm sure Amazon or Azure, whoever spends, makes you spend some extra money. But for the most part, in contrast to some of the stuff that's out there, very low level of investment and doesn't take a ton of expertise to get set up. So you can get some basic monitoring built into your cloud environment. You get some, like I said, basic security minimums, and then make sure your developers like within reason, right? Like your developer laptops. You probably have some level of standards in place, but like, are you going to go full carbon black with 10 developers? Probably not. That seems kind of ridiculous. Then you need a whole security staff and blah, 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 blah. So it's like, I think a lot about the security minimums there and the hygiene aspect, create some very basic policies there. And if you do those things, you're in a better spot as a smaller org. Because like I said, especially if you're a smaller org, you're probably more of a target of opportunity than a targeted attack by an advanced attacker or actor. Mm-hmm. And so anyways, that's my, I don't know. What do you think, Seth? What advice would you give to a small org, doesn't have any real security resources to speak of? Maybe especially in this economy, the budget's getting slashed or whatever. I think this is actually, given the economic situation, the global economic situation, is actually a very timely conversation to have. How would you do it?
Yeah, I like what you said about figure out what the security minimum is, right? Like, we go back to some of those, the books on startups about the minimum viable product, right? But talking about the security minimums is a good way to frame and figure out what is necessary for your organization, right? So, hey, you've got a code base. Everything is in on this, this one code base. Let's make sure that it's protected properly, right? Let's put the security controls around it that we should have in place. Like Ken said, let's make sure that the developer desktops, that who has access to that code, right? Like that is where we start our security story. And you'll probably want to frame it that way to the business people. Like, what is the security story that we want to tell, right? We're accepting data from consumers. All right. How do we make sure that that's protected? That when someone has a question, even though we only have 4 developers on staff and 1 security flagged like executive, that they can answer that question and answer that security story. This is what they're doing. And you can expand out from there as you get more money, as you get more people involved, as you identify more resources, but figure out what the security story is and what your minimum security needs to be in order to protect your organization and not be the low-hanging fruit. Like every organization is going to be different, right? Some of it may be, hey, we want to make sure that all of our call center agents are, their conversations are protected, right? That sort of thing may be more important to your organization than some of the access layers or some of the other things that you can put into place. That's great, but at least figure out what that is and frame the conversation around that. What you don't want to do is be in the situation where someone asks you what your security posture is, and all you say is, hey, yeah, we use military grade encryption, right? That's that was the standard story for so long, which goes back to another one of these points, right? We can get to that. But that would be my recommendation, is figure out what that story is, ask that question, and start there.
Yeah. And I think Rafin, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, his comment there around because there's another element to this too, which is do you fall under HIPAA, PCI, NIST, SOC 2, Type 2, GDPR, whatever, there's also those things you have to be in line with. However, a lot of things you just mentioned, Seth, they fall within those frameworks. If you're doing, security minimums and you're prioritizing correctly, it probably falls within some of those bits there. And I don't know that was actually what Rafin, and again, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. I don't know if that's necessarily what, if that's probably more about yeah. Anyways, I think it may be related. And I I also, this is the other comment from the chat was, regarding attackers don't care. And that whole rule is no, but you don't understand that's a different team. So it's out of scope, even though our product is critically dependent on its implementation it's a classic. Yeah, totally a classic response to things that's frustrating for sure.
I like his other comment there too. Oh, or we patch that vulnerability mentally, but cannot physically prove it despite what the scanner says, right?
Yeah.
Oh, it's already been taken care of. The scanner's wrong.
Yeah. It's a tough, hey, we work in a tough field, it's not an easy thing. And these are the things you deal with. And I forget somebody posted something somewhere in here about, Juan did, about Swift on Security putting a tweet out there that said, I'm sorry to report that working in security is less bleeding edge malware research and more project manager for people who don't report to you. That's 100% the truth. That is, yeah. I mean, honestly, I feel like
did you fix that vulnerability yet? Right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Or hey, did you implement this thing in your secure code requirement into this, or did you hook it into our monitoring, or I don't know, whatever thing you can think of. It's a lot of and also it's a lot of because I'll expand even the cybersecurity as a team sport to not just security teams, but it's for sure engineering teams, because this is the one thing I would say that is critically important. And if you're a small org, this might actually be easier. Is to just cultivate relationships with other teams outside of security, because you're best at. I know we talk about security champions, and so this is very obvious to people, but I don't know that it's I think that's usually got more of a technical bend to it. But I have to be honest with you, the most value I've ever gotten out of establishing relationships is more with product managers who have specific things they're working with their team to build on, and know who. So questions might come up. Hey, we think we need to put this control into place on this product. Because for whatever reason, how is that going to impact the user story here? Well, if it's just security and some technical engineers on a call, nobody's going to have that answer. You need somebody who has a bird's eye view, who knows the people to talk to given the situation that you're in, and who to pull in, and who to get an answer from, and also to make you aware of things. This is the flip side of that. Security can't be everywhere at once. And I can tell you, at an org like ours, code is going just nonstop, right? Just being developed all the time. I can't, you talk about ruthless prioritization and how do you do that? Yeah, there's a lot of ways, but an important one is just the human beings being, willing to come and say to you, hey, we're talking about this on our roadmap. And like, there's some security things that kind of like we touched on in a meeting and we didn't really know the answers. Like, you should probably engage with so-and-so, and that's, again, I feel like most people think of security champions in like a technical IC engineering, or maybe an engineering team lead kind of thing. But I think that's, if you're limiting it to just that, it's maybe a mistake.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Well, and I mean, this goes to this goes to number 10 in the list, right? Technology doesn't solve people and process problems. As much as we want to, expect that the scanner goes out and finds all the vulnerabilities, a lot of the issues that we see come about because people are involved. And it's great that there's AI that's out there that can, perform red team activities, that can break down a code base. But at some level, security is a people problem and it's a people solution. So engaging with, the team, right? Like making it a team sport, engaging with your project managers, engaging with security champions, using them as your eyes and ears, like that all falls under this umbrella of, hey, it's a people problem that has to be solved by people, right? Security. And so I really like that last, half a sentence. Cybersecurity is a human challenge and will never be solved by technology alone. It just won't, right? Like it's, I mean, it's a short way of saying, people are the problem, but people are also the solution.
Which is why you engineer for, worst case scenarios. It's part of, I think, why zero trust has become such a hot thought leader buzzwordy concept, because I mean, you're limiting. You have to understand that for sure you're going to be like, someone could screw up and not just click a link, but they could just do something. I mean, frankly, I can't say where, but I have we have a mutual friend who worked at a place, and internally they transferred a bunch of money to a fraudster. Like a high level exec made that mistake, who shouldn't have made that mistake, but it was because it was so believable, and it was a lot of money, and blah 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 blah. And it happened purely because, like I said, it was very convincing. They were kind of like, it sounded like from the secondhand, thirdhand story I heard, that person was, a busy person, has a lot on their plate. Didn't look out of the normal. This person's used to transferring lots of money to lots of different vendors. So it was an easy mistake to make. Having said that, hopefully you have like insurance and things like that, just like in security, right? Like things are bound to happen and go wrong. The mistakes are going to be made. There's a variety of reasons why. So you typically try to engineer to expect that. And also, this is why you've got your incident response teams. They have their playbooks. They have their exercises they go through for these scenarios. There's a million things we do these days to basically just acknowledge that, you're probably likely to get breached in some way, and maybe not just once. And it's probably through human error. So we'll do our best. We'll segment things, institute, both technological and processes that, address this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's, it's a human problem, and that's never going to be solved like many other things in the world.
Yep. Yeah. And I know we're about out of time for today. Like, we didn't quite get to the other article, but I did want to touch on, seven, like the items 7, 8, and 9 that are on here. 7 and 8 are related, right? Like, network isn't as trustworthy as you think, right? I would also like expand this out to your app, and also your employees are not as trustworthy as you think, right? And then number 8 is isolated networks aren't automatically secure. And again, I would expand that out, like application components, application libraries, third parties. Like even though you like developers pull them in, it doesn't automatically mean that they are secure. Open source software isn't automatically secure. Like any component has to be reviewed and is not. it's not as secure as you're expecting it to be, is basically what it boils down to. There's always edge cases, there's always loopholes, there's always shortcuts that are taken in any piece of software. And it goes back to that number 10, that it was built by people, and people have a tendency to, implement those sorts of shortcuts.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the last one that we haven't reviewed yet is encryption alone isn't a data protection solution. You've never had issues with that, right, Ken? It's always been encryption solves everything, right?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It definitely does not. But that's, from an application security.
Sorry.
No, yeah, of course. Yeah. From an application security perspective, there's numerous ways. That goes wrong. There's numerous ways, even encryption being, actually, it's funny because, we were just talking about how I was, chatting with Mike yesterday, and we were talking. It just came up naturally, that whole Auth0 JWT library where you can call decode versus verify, and most people call decode incorrectly. So it decodes it, and you think that's a security check, and then it's like not, and so the signature could be totally invalid, and the rest of the components therefore invalid. But however, the application. Anyways, my point is like, there's a number of ways that goes wrong. So yeah, this is absolutely, number 9 is spot on. From data at rest, data in transit, ways that we use encryption to validate identity and access control. Yeah, it's just a myriad of ways this goes wrong.
Yeah, and everyone has a different understanding of what encryption means, right, within their day-to-day. Part of you being a security expert is identifying where it's appropriate, when it's not, when encryption is in play, what you're actually protecting against with those different encryption components. It's not necessarily an easy solution. Yeah.
I mean, we started this podcast talking about the CVE for OpenSSL, which was literally a issue in the parsing and buffering of the verification of the signature. So it's where it was like the Punycode parser for Unicode to ASCII, right? Literally that OpenSSL library. What can you do if you've upgraded to like? Actually, never mind. I won't go there. But if you've upgraded and you're like on the most recent version, or like more recent version, you would think, hey, we're secure and it's an encryption library that's well vetted and blah, blah, blah. And it turns out, no, I mean, granted, and we didn't get to it, not as serious for a number of reasons than initially expected. But point is, encryption doesn't always work, right?
Yep.
So, yeah.
There's always going to be a problem. And I did like that, what Rafin was saying too, right? Like the cybersecurity is dependent on 3 Ps, right? People, product, and procedure.
Absolutely.
The balance has to be there, right? And so like if you're too overly dependent on one of those, like the product or the technology, then it's probably going to fall down, right? If you're expecting people to do everything they can, right? It's that learning for your organization what that balance needs to be to give you the best protection to prevent the attacker's ROI from being successful. So I mean, it's a good discussion to have, right? Like I knew it was going to go longer than we expected, right? And we obviously did, because we spent an hour just talking about those 10 things. Maybe I'll stop the sharing really quick, but I mean, it's not all doom and gloom though, right? Like if you can learn those lessons from that article sooner in your career and apply those in your organization, you're going to be better off than Ken and I were as we're stumbling around inside of different organizations trying to figure out why certain aspects of security were either too effective or not effective enough, like why we weren't getting buy-in. It all plays in under one of those levels or under one of those laws. If you have a chance, go read those immutable laws that are recommended to the Immutable Laws of Security. I mean, those are more kind of tongue in cheek, right? Like once someone else has access to your system, your application, it's no longer just your application, right? Somebody else can do something with it. But I mean, so my final thought there is, it's not all doom and gloom. Learn those lessons, apply them in your day to day, and you will be better off, and you'll be able to move the needle further along than someone who hasn't, taken that step back to consider those different options or those different points. What are your final thoughts there, Ken?
To your point, yeah, we learned all this stuff the hard way, I guess. It's probably, and honestly, it's not a destination, right? Just kind of to the point of like always moving forward. My understanding will evolve, just as will yours. And next month, next year, we might look at things slightly differently. And I think that's important to grow from some of those painful experiences or the best experiences. But anyways, yeah.
Cool.
It's a continual process of evolution. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yes. Wasn't that number, yeah, I can't remember. Not number 2, not keeping up is falling behind, right? Like it's going to change and expect it to change, right? Like just be comfortable with that.
Yep.
Sweet. Well, good. If you want to join the conversation, there's been a lot of good feedback today. We appreciate that. We appreciate the comments, the experiences that everyone has. If you would like to join the Slack channel, you can get there from absoluteappsec.com or Twitter. It did get tweeted out as in the thread for today's episode. But yeah, would love to, see anyone next week or, Cactus Con. Let us know where other people are going to be from a conference perspective. We will try to get to a few more conferences. I don't know how much more will be this year, but into next year for sure. January, February, March, first quarter time frame. We are scheduling out that travel now. Cool. Anything else, Ken, before we call it today?
No, just as usual. Thank you for everybody who supports the podcast by viewing. So genuinely, thank you. Wish I could be at DeepSec. Not going to be able to make it, but we'll have other conferences. And anyways, just like I said, thank you for all the support. We wouldn't keep doing this podcast if it wasn't for that. So, yeah.
Yep, exactly. Sweet, man. All right. Well, thanks everybody. And I don't know if we're going to have an episode next week because of DeepSec, but we will figure that out. Watch the YouTube channel and Twitter, and we will post when the next episode will go live. Ciao.
All right. Bye.